Okay, great. Well, hello everybody, and welcome to Worldviews. Today we have on Loyd Auerbach. He's a parapsychologist, paranormal investigator, and mentalist. He has appeared on numerous television shows that profile ghost hunting and other paranormal topics. And he's the author of several books on ghost hunting, parapsychology, and other paranormal subjects. Loyd, welcome to Worldviews.
Thanks very much, Devin.
Well, can you first just break down how you got into parapsychology and the paranormal investigation field?
Yeah, I started an interest when I was a kid, partly because of television and discovering when I was probably about 12 or 13 that there actually were science books about parapsychology, about psychic phenomena. I had that interest in ghosts and psychic experiences and psychic abilities from different TV shows growing up and from comic books as well. And finding books by J.B. Ryan, J.G. Pratt, and other folks in the field, because I was really interested in science, was kind of eye opening. Had a parapsychology club I started in high school in New York, and then was able to incorporate my interest in that in my anthropology studies at Northwestern. Timing wise, I was very fortunate that there was actually a master's in parapsychology, a master degree from John F. Kennedy University back between the late 70s and the mid 80s. So I kind of timed it exactly right. And that just got me into it. And it was really the first semester in grad school where I went on my first investigation that made me realize that I was much more interested in investigation outside the lab than actually doing experiments inside the lab.
And for parapsychologists, do they typically have a religious background, or is there typically kind of more agnostic?
It's pretty much irrelevant. I mean, when you go into science of any kind, that's only relevant if you're doing like religious studies or you have a very religious approach. I mean, there are some people that are probably, I don't know anybody who's very religious within parapsychology, but folks come from a variety of religious backgrounds. But we're talking about science. We're trying to understand consciousness and phenomena that is human. And that's mainly what we're dealing with.
And what would you say some misconceptions about the parapsychology field are?
Well, I mean, one of them still carries over from the 60s and 70s where there were so many books out there about all sorts of weird things. It was called the occult explosion actually in publishing back in the late 60s into the 70s. You couldn't go anywhere like where there was a spindle of paperbacks and not found books on everything from parapsychology in general to witchcraft, UFOs, the Bermuda Triangle, all sorts of topics. And all of that was conflated under parapsychology by some authors. So people will say, well, why don't you study UFOs? It's like, because that's not about people's experiences of being psychic. We don't deal with that. We don't deal with Bigfoot. I mean, if Bigfoot was psychic, maybe we would deal with that Bigfoot, but we really deal with experiences of humans and sometimes animals. We do have an area where we look at the psychic abilities of animals. It's human experience. So that's mainly what we're doing. So that's one big misconception. Another is that what we're studying is supernatural, and it's not. It's not even paranormal, honestly. By the numbers of people who have these experiences across the world, across cultures, across time, these are not uncommon experiences. Now, they may be uncommon in a single individual's experience, but they're not uncommon amongst human experiences at all. So they're really normal. They may be rare, but they're normal.
Okay. And I read on your site that you said that apparitions of parapsychology is the topic that interests you most. Can you break down what that means entirely and also why that interests you the most?
Sure. When one does field investigations, I mean, there's a range of things we might be talking to people about outside the lab. You know, one is their ESP experiences. Another might be looking at psychokinesis or mind over matter experiences. Poltergeist phenomena fits into that category. Those also interest me quite a bit. Apparition experiences are really interesting because you're dealing potentially with the idea that consciousness can exist outside the body after the body's dead and still interact with the physical world in some way, shape, or form. So these are really interesting to me because it supports the idea of life after death, of survival of bodily death in general. And because some of the better experiences are really supportive, they're contradictory to materialist philosophy, which we even have materialists within parapsychology who just think it's all in the brain. But it's pretty clear that this is something much more than that. So again, ideas of consciousness, supporting consciousness on its own, and what that might be.
And so for the life after death stuff, are you convinced that's a real reality, or are you more agnostic towards that subject too?
I am convinced the evidence points in that direction and supports the idea that consciousness can survive the death of the body in some form. The evidence does not show that everybody becomes a ghost per se here in the physical world. Most people tend to either move on to wherever it is they go. Um, they rarely ever stick around more than just initial saying goodbye. In fact, the majority of ghost experiences, apparitional encounters, are people who knew the person and the person appears to them in some way, shape, or form at the moment of death or within a couple of days, and then they're gone. And they're gone for good, more or less, unless a medium can communicate with them on the other side, so to speak. So that piece of evidence, and then other kinds of experiences, including near death experiences, some of the mediumistic communications. There's a number of things that we look at that do support the evidence supports that there is consciousness that can survive the death of the body.
Interesting. Do you have any cases that come to mind, like stories or cases you personally studied that really convinced you?
Well, the one that really convinced me is has actually written up in a book by Leslie Kean, Kean,
Yeah, yeah.
Surviving Death. And she had asked me to contribute this story. So this was a case back in late 84, early 85. It was a family that were kind of confronted with this curious situation. They were not afraid at all. They had moved into a house a year and a half before. Individually, the mother, the father, the son, and the woman's mother, when she visited, were all seeing this older woman's apparition walking around the house and even reacting to them. The day that they called, the mother called me, she had been talking to her son, and it turned out he had been talking to the ghost, having conversations every single day since the first time he saw her. And even said to his mother, you know, Mom, the ghost that you, Dad, and Grandma are seeing but aren't talking about. So he knew that they were seeing the ghost. They didn't even talk to each other about that. In the process of investigation, especially in the kind of lengthy interview we did with the family and the sit down, where apparently we were told by the boy that the ghost was sitting in an easy chair next to him. So he was kind of translating for her. We got family stories about this woman growing up in the house and other family members coming to events in the house. We got the information that allowed me to contact the only living relative of this woman, who was 92 in a nearby assisted living facility. He confirmed every one of the family stories I was told. The mother was a really smart attorney, and she had already been through the house. When they bought the house, they got it in an estate sale because there really was only this one guy who was connected to the family after the woman died, and she did not die in the house, mind you. Um, so they got a lot of furniture and other things. She'd been through the house looking for any records and anything else, couldn't find anything. So there was no record of these family stories. And yet I would start a story, and the guy I was speaking to on the phone, the relative, would finish the story. So that was pretty clear. And then in our conversation, I was able to ask the ghost, more or less. Chris, the boy, was actually translating why she was there, what happened when she died, what she thought of herself in terms of form, just a whole bunch of questions, some of which related directly to our models of apparitions, which you would have been hard pressed to find written up at the time in any book easily accessed by this kid or the parents for that matter. So we got a lot of confirmation. And then there was one other really bizarre thing. I had driven down with two people from John F. Kennedy University, which is about 40 minutes from the town of Livermore where we were doing this case. And I said, "Does Lois have any questions for us?" And the first question actually was kind of funny. It was, this was 84, 85. So first question was, do you have any of those blasters like in Ghostbusters? Which was kind of a fun thing to deal with. I don't know that that was really the ghost question or Chris's question. And then, Loyd, what kind of new car do you want? Joanna, do you really want to quit your job? Kip, how long were you a professional dancer before you came back to grad school? All those things were true. They're all related to our conversation in my car on the drive to Livermore, not at all mentioned whatsoever because I had a tape running. Nothing mentioned when we walked in the house. So that gave me only three possibilities. Actually, really only two at the time, but one was somehow they bugged my car, which there was no motivation. There was literally no reason for that. Not to mention the fact she would have had this is before a lot of online research. She would have had to figure out what my car was, all of that. Second was Chris really psychic and just reading our minds? Which again, there was no indication that Chris had any other psychic abilities other than being able to connect with Lois. So I asked, how does Lois know this? And the response was kind of funny. It was like, well, she didn't trust you guys because of Ghostbusters. So she got in your car at the university and she listened in on your conversation on the drive to Livermore, which caused Kip, who was in the back seat at the time, to kind of turn a little green. So that was a really, I never thought to ask her at the time. I was too shocked to ask her how she got to the university to begin with. I guess she just flew or got another ride somewhere.
Wow. And you said this is early in your career, correct?
Yeah, this was so I started working teaching. I went to John F. Kennedy University from 79 to 81, worked in New York City at a research place for almost 2 years, and then moved back out to be on faculty at JFK University in late 83. So this was late 84. It was after Ghostbusters had been in the theater for quite some time. There were TV commercials about it, a lot of media. I did a huge amount of media as a real life Ghostbuster that fall, which is how they even found me and found our program. So it was not unusual that we got questions about that.
You said you were in shock to some degree, but what were the ideas going through your mind during that whole experience? It just must have been existentially
Well,
mysterious.
it was really interesting. I was agnostic about the idea of life after death or apparitions being conscious or versus something else. And it really brought home the evidence that we had been looking at, all the work that I had done in grad school, some of what I did at the research organization, looking at the history. It really kind of made sense.
Wow. And I figure when you run that by people around you and tell that story, are they usually pretty skeptical, or are they more like, oh, I could see that?
Most people, I don't think they're if they're skeptical, it's in the I'm not sure kind of realm of true
Sure.
skepticism as opposed to disbelieving.
Okay. Yeah. That is crazy. Do you have any other stories similar, or any other near-death experience stories? Here, it's like, okay, this one too really makes me feel like something's definitely going on as well.
I mean, I haven't had a near death experience myself, but I've talked to a number of people with near death experiences, and there's some really interesting. When looking at the research reports, there's some really classic cases on record. A very famous case in that area is a woman named Pam Reynolds who was having very delicate brain surgery to the point where they had to lower her body temperature to 60 degrees, and there was no detectable brain activity at that point. After she was resuscitated after the surgery, she reported having left, basically floated above her body, and was able to recount all the conversation the surgeons had, and then also talked about things going on in other operating theaters because she moved about the hospital. So there's no detectable brain activity at that point. And honestly, if it was because her ears could still hear the conversation, the eardrum would still have reacted to sound and triggered some activity in the brain, and there was nothing discernible there. So people have said, well, she overheard the conversation, but the brain wasn't operating. So it really was much more than that. And there was no way for her to have known what was going on in other operating theaters. There are some similar cases like that where the people were being under surgery and they were able to recount things that they saw floating around the hospital without a body, more or less. That there's literally no way they could have seen or heard, and so on. And there are other kinds of stories like that as well.
Wow. Okay, speaking of that too, I want to hop into your experience on those television shows about ghost hunting. How were those experiences? Because usually people would say, "Oh, there's absolutely nothing realistic about their shows. But did you find that that wasn't such the case?
Well, I have to say, first of all, I've done a lot of segments for different kinds of shows, news magazines. I did something for Unsolved Mysteries for a show back in the 90s called Sightings, which included investigations and such. And for the most part, those were done, they were condensed, but they were still generally presented correctly. I've been around some of the reality TV stuff. I grew up in the television industry. My dad worked for NBC. My uncle worked for CBS. So I kind of grew up at 30 Rocks. I spent a lot of time. My dad was a producer, and I spent a lot of time in that world. Uh, and I've been around and talked to producers and even consulted on some shows. Reality TV is not reality, and it's not just the paranormal. It's like Real Housewives does not present what actually happens. It presents what might have been a little bit of what happened. So, for example, maybe they have a big argument on Real Housewives and almost a knockdown, drag out fight. They start yelling at each other. There probably was an argument that was on camera, and the director or producer said, "Ooh, let's do that again." But so, in doing these shows, I actually got cut out of an Unsolved Mysteries segment because I refused to use the conclusion that the director wanted to present about a case that clearly was not demonic. He wanted to make it demonic. I would not say anything like that. I actually found a local pastor who had nothing to do with the case who just automatically said it must be a demon. But even the people experiencing something, what was going on in the house, they didn't think there was anything evil about it. It's just that's what this director wanted to make this segment seem like. I've been in situations on shows where they, typically, just as a normal situation, they shoot you walking into a room from behind. Then they ask you to do it again. Now they put the camera inside, so they shoot you walking into the room from the front. And sometimes they'll say, "Can you come in a little faster and move over to the right?" In other words, these shows are not scripted per se, although they sometimes know what they want to have in the episode up front, but they are directed, including asking a question or comment, and then can you repeat that but shorter? Now give me a longer version. In other words, they get to choose which version they like, which shot they like in the edit room, which is where we never are. This whole idea of working in the dark that reality TV has presented, if you go back before, certainly before 2000 and generally before the mid 1990s to any segments on ghost hunting, you don't see anybody working in the dark. And the main reason for that is there's two reasons. Number one, technically, you need night shot camera to work in the dark. Otherwise, they can't show anything. All right. So night shot camera, which came in the early 90s, made things commercially possible for TV companies and others to make it spooky by having the lights turned out. Not possible before that. In the 1980s, I did a lot of segments. Even though the case was something that happened during the day, some directors wanted to shoot at night with the lights down low because it was going to be shown at Halloween and they wanted to make it spooky, even though the case wasn't spooky. When Night Shot came in, new ball game. All reality shows started doing darkness because it looks spooky, especially with your eyes looking, glowing in the dark kind of thing. Uh, Real researchers don't do darkness unless that's the only condition the ghost has appeared, or at least one of the conditions. But you can take all of these cases, and before ghost hunters like the shows got involved, if the public places were haunted, nobody ever experienced anything at 3 in the morning because there was nobody ever there at 3 o'clock in the morning. So if people said it was haunted, you ask them what their experiences are. They had the experiences during the day when the lights on, and that's the case with people's homes as well. So it's really a major bit of TV magic to make things look spooky in that way. They edit things in ways that may not reference what actually happened. They could shoot for 20 hours or even 30 hours and for a 22-minute segment. I actually did a 4-minute segment for Our Magazine in 1984, and we shot all day at different locations to come up with a 4.5-minute piece on investigations. So, it's like shooting a movie. You do many takes, you may wait for something to happen in some instances. And then if nothing happens, because I know for a fact that some of the shows have faked things as well, it's for effect. And the main reason is these shows are supposed to be for entertainment. They're not for education. They're for ratings.
Yeah, and then for the most part, would you say those were, I guess, enjoyable experiences nonetheless, or do you think they're kind of a hassle at times?
Many of the ones that I've done, I've worked with some good producers and directors. There have been a few that honestly, fortunately, the pieces came out okay, but there were times that I got a lot frustrated with the director or producer. The one I got cut out of on for Unsolved Mysteries was really not a great experience. So just dealing with that director was not a great experience. There have been a couple of instances in the '80s, especially, which was after Ghostbusters, which was pretty funny. In that there were times the director would say, don't you have any? And I got this request a lot up front. Don't you have anything that makes noise and lights up? Basically equipment. Because they wanted to show stuff on TV and they couldn't show a ghost, so they wanted to show something else. And we started using EMF meters because we're looking at the environment. We're not looking for ghosts using EMF. We're using these devices to see if something changes in the environment when someone sees a ghost or experiences a ghost. Those don't really they didn't really light up or make noise. So whenever I had a difficult director, and it was two or three times, I would pull out a toy Star Trek tricorder from my bag. I still have it on my shelf here, and I would turn it on and it lit up and made noise. And I knew just generally from people in the TV industry that somebody asking that question probably didn't watch Star Trek. So the director got all excited. Every single time, I also knew the camera guy was going to stop rolling. So I would always get this look from the camera guy and a little wink, and they would stop rolling, and we would kind of play it up a little bit. Um, it helps having grown up in that industry to actually pull things like that. Of course, the director would get upset, but we were trying to teach him a lesson.
Interesting. And your students, when they take your classes, do they know that you've had these television experiences as well? I'm sure they try to come up to you with their own stories and whatnot.
Yeah, I mean, basically, right now I'm teaching mostly online classes and doing that kind of work especially since the pandemic. But when I teach for the Rhine Education Center, our online classes have always been online, partly because we're trying to pull students from all over the world. When I've taught locally, people know that I've been on TV. Sometimes that brings them to whatever. I have a YouTube channel that has a lot of my TV appearances on it. So people have seen those kinds of things. I am the only Loyd Auerbach. So if you run a Google search on me, you're going to get to a lot of my stuff over the years. So it's pretty easy to find that. And I do have students who talk about their own experiences. I get a lot of emails with people asking about their own experiences and just talking to people in general in all walks of life. They now have somebody who seems like he's sane and they can tell a story to, which they've never told to anybody else. So this is something I do hear quite a bit.
I'm also curious, in your how long have you been a professor for?
Since 1983.
Okay, 83. Out of all those years, could you pinpoint a certain course that was your favorite to teach?
I've had a couple of really favorite classes. I do love teaching. There's one class I teach. Actually, right now I'm teaching this class, which is something I used to teach in a different format and a different reason at John F. Kennedy University. Um, the course I'm teaching right now is called Presenting the Paranormal to the Public. So I covered last night my first class. First, it's a 4-week class, and I covered how to sound credible, how to use the right language to talk to people, how to know your audience. And I talk about next week I'll be doing public speaking because I've been a public speaking coach, but specifically about the paranormal, and then talking about writing about it and dealing with media, all of that, all the things that I learned practically over the years. So that's a favorite course. Another one that I really like teaching is how to choose and assess a psychic. So, in other words, how to really get an understanding of whether the person you're dealing with is psychic, whether it's a medium or a psychic. If you want somebody for an investigation, how do you assess that person? I talk a little bit about faking it quite a bit in that course. Also, is you have to understand how fraud works in that way, and that kind of pulls from my magic and mentalism background going all the way back to the grad studies I had. We had a local magician teach us a course called Creation of Illusions about psychic fraud. And I ended up teaching that a few times at JFK as well. So that's been a favorite class. And then one I don't get to teach often enough is pop culture and the paranormal. where I get to talk about science fiction, comic books, television, movies, all that stuff. That's a fun
O-
class.
Okay, so you're a movie guy then?
Movie, TV, yeah.
My intrusive thoughts are taking over, so I have to ask, what's your? I assume you enjoy sci-fi films.
Yeah.
Okay, what do you think? Maybe the three best sci-fi films you've ever seen, or when I say that question, what three come to your mind immediately?
Wow. That's a really tough question for sci-fi specifically because I have a kind of wide range of things. I would say, well, number one, the original Star Wars, even though it's science fantasy in some respects, that comes to mind right off the bat. Another one that comes to mind is the movie Forbidden Planet, 1956. Leslie Nielsen. It was the first big budget, really big budget science fiction film, and it's kind of the inspiration for Star Trek in a lot of ways. And the third one, I'm going to have to think about that a bit. I have a bunch of favorites, certainly. Um, Galaxy Quest, that's it. Pops right in my head. Galaxy
Oh,
Quest.
good pick.
I've seen that many, many times. I think it's the best Star Trek movie ever made.
Yeah, that's fun. Do you have a favorite film outside of those?
Yeah, one of my favorites is The Thin Man. I love the old Thin Man series. My mom was an old film buff as well. She liked old movies, so I really love the interplay with the characters in that film. I actually really love Army of Darkness as well, just because it's Bruce Campbell is the guy.
Yeah, that's good. Have you seen The Thing?
Yeah, John Carpenter's and the original both. Yeah,
Oh, yeah, that's like one of my. That's like a
the thing is
masterpiece to
the
me.
thing is a really good sci-fi film too. Yeah, it's a sci-fi horror film, but it's really good. I mean, Alien, the original Alien, was amazing as a science fiction and horror film at the same time.
Yeah, those are all just like, oh, so good to me. But I also wanted to dive into your experience volunteering for J. Allen Hynek.
Yeah, yeah, that was a college thing. So when I was in high school, I had a parapsychology club, but I was also interested in UFOs and some other things too. And I was originally going to go to college for astronomy, astrophysics. So when we looked at schools and in general, I looked at schools that had a good astronomy department. And my dad was traveling a bit for NBC. He was doing the game of the week, and I got to go to visit like University of Virginia, Rensselaer Polytechnic, and a few other universities. And I got to go to Northwestern. It happened my dad was actually doing a ball game out there. So this was my junior year in high school. My uncle had gone there, so I was sort of looking forward to seeing that campus as well. And I knew Jalen Hynek was the astronomy department head, so that was kind of a plus for Northwestern as well. Fell in love with the campus, got to meet with Hynek when I was there just for that visit, and that was part of what made me finally decide to go to Northwestern over other schools. That and when I got home that evening after the ball game, we flew back. There was a syndicated TV show from the amazing Kreskin, the mentalist. And his guest that night was J. Allen Hynek, which I thought was the universe telling me, this is where you need to go. So when I first got to Northwestern as a student, Hynek for many years did the opening presentation to the freshman class, and he did it on UFOs. And I talked to him afterwards. I knew the Center for UFOs was at his home in Evanston. And I asked if he needed volunteers. It might not have been that night, but it might have been another time that I was talking to him at the astronomy department. And he needed volunteers to go through their material. So I spent time, a few hours here and there every week for many weeks running, going through the photocopies and original UFO reports that he had gathered, some of which were photocopies of what he had taken from Blue Book, because he was the civilian advisor to Project Blue Book. And there were a couple of things he had me basically categorizing them as daylight discs or nighttime lights. And then if I noticed anything really unusual about a report that was very, very different than others, to pull those out as well. Um, it was really interesting to me to see that didn't matter who experienced or who saw the UFO, whether they were an Air Force pilot or a cop or a farmer or just a business person or a mother. The reports were pretty consistent. across the board. There were also some that one of the things I learned from Hynek is that the reports that were classified that were out there were generally classified not because of the UFO sighting. They were military or other government personnel who were doing something or were in a location doing something that itself was classified. So while they were doing something classified, they saw a UFO. And that was what classified the report, not the UFO sighting itself. So that was a kind of a major eye opener for me, considering people were always talking about how classified these UFO reports are.
Wow. I never thought about that. Interesting. And I know you might have spoke on this a little bit already, but so what is your overall opinion on the UFO phenomenon itself? Do you hold any weight there? Do you any
I mean, I think
opinions or
I, I do, from all the evidence I saw and talking to Hynek about it, I think there's something flying around. I do know, having worked also years later with Martin Caidin, who was a science and science fiction writer and was kind of a consultant to NASA. He had been in military intelligence previously at one point in his career, and he looked into the UFO stuff as well. He was an aviation expert, and some of the things that have been cited as UFOs were our stuff, experimental aircraft, things like that. So that's one of the problems that we kind of run into, especially maybe not so much anymore, but certainly in the 70s and 80s and into the 90s. The SR-71, the Blackbird bomber, which is the ship the craft that is in the X-Men movie, that was seen, it's a stealth aircraft, and it was reported as a UFO multiple times when they were flying it around originally. So we have to look at those kinds of things. But there are things that are doing things with physics that don't make any sense. Hynek was not convinced that everything people saw were nuts and bolts hardware. Some things resisted being picked up by radar, which meant a number of possible explanations. One of the things he was looking at, one of the reasons I really enjoyed talking to him was that he knew a lot about parapsychology. And like Carl Jung, the famous psychologist, he felt that some UFOs might be psychic projections or shared hallucinations that people had. But on the other hand, he was the man who coined close encounters of the first, second, and third kind. And he did investigations where there was actual physical evidence. So that would indicate nuts and bolts hardware. The one thing he would not never say, and I agree with him, is you can't say that they're extraterrestrials or time travelers or other dimensions. We just don't know who's flying them in that sense. There's no way to actually pin that down at all. But I do think there's something out there that we have to pay attention to. Marty Caidin actually pointed out that the reason for so long the Pentagon was resistant to even acknowledge that these things exist is because to acknowledge that they exist, and this has come up a number of times now since the Pentagon has been, the Navy's been talking about things, that admitting that the military admitting we have stuff flying around our airspace and we can't do anything about it, we don't even know who it is contradictory to the military mindset. In other words, talking to the public about it. So it's better to pretend like you know something and you're keeping it a secret than to say, yeah, we can't do anything about it.
Mm, wow. And it's interesting too because when you're volunteering for Hynek as well, I mean, this was during a time where if you believed in UFOs, you're almost seen as crazy, I assume. So it's almost
Well, I mean,
unpop.
Hynek had already published a number of books. I think that they were being looked at by enough folks back in the 70s that the crazy piece of it, I mean, in certain jobs or industries like airline pilots could never say anything about seeing a UFO because there would be serious repercussions for them. Uh, but it was something that was talked about, and there were folks from different fields that were looking at it. Certainly, we may not have Project Blue Book anymore, but there were still folks in military intelligence and other areas that were looking into it. That's what I was told by Caden. So, it's like with talking about ghosts. People think you're weird if you say anything about it until they pull you aside separately and say, okay, I got to tell you about my ghost story. And that happens to me quite a bit.
Mm. And then talking about the government too, do you think the government has discovered some kind of metaphysical ability, such as remote viewing, telekinesis, something along those lines, that they're hiding from the public?
Nothing about the remote viewing program is secret anymore. And in fact, when the original program got started at SRI by Targan Putoff, they were also publishing papers. So they were working with military people, teaching them, working through remote viewing, and they were taking requests and tasks from various government agencies, which were classified. So psychic spying, basically. At the same time they were doing that, they were doing research that they were publishing in parapsychology journals or presenting to the the population of the Parapsychological Association. In other words, there was like a secret version and there was the public version of remote viewing research. And the only real difference was who was doing the viewing and what they were trying to view or spy on in that sense. I co-authored a book called ESP Wars East and West, which has the full history of the U.S. government's program. The main author is Edwin C. May, who is the program director from 85 to 95 when it closed, and he was actually involved in the program for years before that. Joe McMoneagle is one of the authors. He was viewer 0001, the main viewer, the best viewer the government had. And we go into the history, not only of psychic spying before that program, but why that program got started, and then also some of the kind of hits and misses that the program actually had. And then Ed published, once everything was declassified, Ed published 4 volumes, pretty hefty volumes of the Stargate archives. So that stuff is not secret. There were still missions or tasks that themselves are still classified simply because what the intelligence was classified, not because the remote viewing process itself was classified. And the government shut down the program for political reasons. Ed has mentioned often that I think it was 21 government agencies who came originally to the various remote viewing groups and would ask them to do something for them. 17 of those organizations, those agencies, kept coming back. And so you don't keep going back to a source who's giving you bad information. So even though several of them didn't keep coming back, many of them did. 17 came back over the years. And that indicates the success, the ability to get good intelligence from remote viewing. But it's not a secret. I mean, even people have been teaching remote viewing even before the program was known it existed.
Wow. And forgive me, for the sake of our audience, can you describe what remote viewing means and also just use an example of what it could be used for?
Sure. So remote viewing is a form of ESP, non-sensory perception. So one thing to clear up, extrasensory perception is not a sixth sense. That's something that comes out of media and pop culture. A sense has a physical organ, our eyes, our ears, and our tongue, all of that. Extrasensory perception is called extrasensory, not because it's an extra sense, but because it's extrasensory, it's non-sensory perception. Perception is not the same thing as your sense. Our perceptual processes take the information from our senses and then gives us a picture and gives us what we need to know about the world. So ESP brings in information we can't possibly know. Remote viewing is a special case of ESP in the sense that the target you're looking for is not in an envelope in front of you, but it's remote. Got to be a little ways away. I mean, Ed would probably say at least a half a mile. I don't know if it has to be that far to be remote, but it could be thousands of miles away to do remote viewing. And you can also do precognitive remote viewing, looking into the future a little bit. So remote viewing really is not just viewing. It's not just visual stuff that people get. It is information you get. And the best remote viewers also may get auditory stuff, and they might get smells and sensations of the location that they're trying, or the target they're trying to focus on. So there are many different applications for it. One of which is what the Stargate program did. What were the Russians doing on a given day? What were they building inside a huge warehouse next to a canal? What does this site that we picked up on our spy satellite really have inside? So that's kind of military intelligence. But it can also be used for finding fugitives, for example. There was one example in the FBI had asked the group to find a fugitive. And Angela Ford actually helped the manhunt pin down where this guy actually was in another state. And they caught him. based on that intelligence that she was able to pick up on. So law enforcement can use that if they wanted to. They don't usually do that, but they can. They were doing it in Russia, by the way. Even the KGB was using remote viewing for law enforcement internally. And then it can be used for finding or looking at archaeological sites. Stephen Schwartz used remote viewers to look for a sunken ship, to look below ground to see how far down a dig needs to be and where to focus a dig should be. It's been used to find oil wells and mineral deposits as well. So there's a lot of different applications. We've talked about things like missing people. If somebody's lost, when we hear all these reports of rescue crews that have to go out and find someone who's lost in some forest somewhere, remote viewing potentially could be used to narrow down the search area. So there are plenty of applications for it.
That just it's so mind blowing to me that that's a thing. Because if you say it to an average person, they'll be like, "There's no way that's real." But this is public, accessible information.
Yeah, it absolutely is. And we have the thing about remote viewing. It's one of when it's done in a controlled experiment. It's one of the most repeatable experiments. And there's actually a whole bunch of experiments that were done on live television with one of the remote viewers under controlled conditions. Joe McMoneagle has done a few of them over the years and fully successful. So you can actually see that if you just Google remote viewing, and uh, there's going to be a lot of crap out there. I'll tell you, there are people who have claimed to be part of the program who are trying to sell a course, and sometimes they were with the program for a few months and they might have not even done well, but now they can supposedly teach it for thousands of dollars. That's something that kind of makes Ed May mad and makes the rest of us mad, because there's simple ways you can teach things on remote viewing. In fact, if anybody wants to learn remote viewing, I always point to the Kindle version, which is $4.95 of Joe McMoneagle's book, Remote Viewing Secrets. So for $5, you can learn remote viewing.
It's just it's so insane to me, but it's obviously real. Cool. And when it comes to consciousness, what do you think the connection is between the real world and the dream world?
Well, I mean, from a psychological perspective, in general, dreams are influenced by things that are in our head already, our experiences. There's a lot of times our dreams are influenced by what's called day residue, which is what happened that day that you went to sleep. So the previous day will influence the metaphors, the symbols that appear in dreams, things like that. So there's definitely an impact on your dreams, just like there is, when somebody's writing fiction and making something up, that's kind of informed by what they know, all the things they've been exposed to in their life as well. There are those dreams that are psychic dreams, which do connect with the outside world in many respects, in that dream state, which is an altered state where no rules apply. So when we're awake, we are damping down and completely eliminating sometimes our psychic experiences, because our culture, our education system, the mainstream all say this stuff is not real. Sometimes pop culture is a very, very two-faced uh, opinion about this stuff, where on the one hand they exaggerate it and the other they say it doesn't exist. So all of that, the ability to pick up information without the normal senses, can impinge upon your dreams a lot easier, because you're not there consciously to question whether that's real information or not. And all of your beliefs it doesn't matter. It's just a dream kind of thing. So people often report dreams that come true, either of real time, of connecting with another person, or precognitive dreams. There's a lot of really good uh, precognitive dreams that were told to people before they happened, and then the event actually happened. And I'm not talking about general things like there's going to be an earthquake in California, because there's going to be an earthquake in California almost every day, no matter what you do.
Okay, so you've had obviously so many years of experience studying this parapsychological topics. What do you think? Well, do you have an opinion that changed based on your studies over that time? Like a huge opinion that you didn't think would change, that you actually went back and said, okay, I was wrong about this. This is the correct thing.
I'd say, because remember, as I mentioned earlier, I started reading books on parapsychology when I was like 12 or 13. And I was reading popular stuff, but I was also reading the science and the history of the field as well. So I was exposed to a lot of evidence, a lot of reports, a lot of experiences, a lot of theories, models, all of that beforehand. So I'd already pretty much formed some opinion that there was laboratory, research evidence for this. I also learned early on that not every experience necessarily is psychic, even if somebody thinks it is. We have to actually, one of the things we have to do in our field for any of this is we have to eliminate the normal, the other possible leaking of information. So, is it possible somebody could have known this some other way? We always have to do that. And that's aside from fraud, which we do run into once in a while. Uh, so, I think that really the only thing for me that had changed over time was the idea that the evidence for life after death, for apparitions and such, really was not just a little bit and was suggesting stuff, but it was really supporting this idea that consciousness can exist separate from the body or after the death of the body. I mean, that's the main piece that really shifted for me. Um, I'd always been interested. I mean, I wouldn't have gotten into this field if I didn't already think that there could be people that had psychic abilities.
Wow, jeez. I mean, if I was in your shoes, I feel like I'd be studying this topic, and I can't help but think a lot about being a Christian, being like, what are the implications for both these being related and whatnot? Do you have any opinion on, say, if there's a certain world religion that's closer to being correct based on what you've heard with all this consciousness and near-death experiences, whatnot?
Well, first I need to say that I switched from astronomy after my freshman year over to anthropology, to cultural anthropology. So I spent the other 3 years of my college education, undergrad education, looking at supernatural and psych and magic beliefs around the world, both in religions and in various cultures. And all I can say is that if it feels right to you, it's right to you. But otherwise, everybody's right and everybody's wrong. There are consistencies in near-death experiences across the board, but then there are also some inconsistencies. For example, I talked to a number of people in Japan when I was over there for Japanese television who had near death experiences. And instead of that tunnel and the light, they saw a bridge over a stream or a river and a beautiful flower garden. And waiting for them at the other end of that bridge was one of their ancestors. And this was mainly reported by people who revered their ancestors and maybe even did ancestor worship as part of their religion. Whereas we've seen in studies of Christians and Hindus in India that the person one sees or the entity one sees through the tunnel, or in this case on the other side of the bridge, is often affected by their religious beliefs. So people who are Christian or Catholic have reported Jesus, the saints, or some other religious figure, whereas Hindus have often reported over the years Hindu gods, and there's many of those. There are sometimes people see an entity of light, just see a light, or just hear a voice, which people may not interpret as the voice of God or as something else. And many experiences where people run into deceased relatives. Sometimes they meet people who they knew or they actually know, and they didn't know that person died. So they kind of come out of the near death experience and say, "Hey, I just saw Bob over there. That was really weird." Well, Bob died yesterday. So there's that whole spiritual thing. So I don't know, I don't think that there's any right or wrong for a given religion. It's really how people interpret the spiritual side of us, and also whether they believe there's a greater power that has intelligence and personality and all that, or just a greater power, or even it's just the universe itself that is somewhat conscious.
Mm. Huh. And based on all your years of studying, do you have any regrets at all?
On the one hand, yeah, I have one regret, which is kind of stupid, and I never would have done it because of my ethics in some respect. But after Ghostbusters, I really could have started up a club a ghost hunting club. One of my friends actually was trying to convince me we have a great logo. Let's create a club. Let's sell hats. Let's sell memberships. We can make a fortune. And you know what? Probably could have. So I have one regret on the practical side. I have a regret because I could be a millionaire by now. On the other, I just said no, we can't do that because that's not appropriate at that point. So I do have ethics.
And
Sometimes I
what would you
regret that I have ethics.
and could you pinpoint what the best lesson you learned?
I think the best lesson I learned is that, and it's really one that I kind of went into this field with, that human beings are more than the world tells us we are. There's much more to being human. We have a lot more capabilities. We have a lot more potential. But our education system, our science, mainstream science, religion, all of those keep us down. They tell us what our limits are, and we buy into those limits. I mean, even with people who believe in psychic ability or who can be psychic will have their own glass ceiling that they can't break through simply because that's their belief system. Let me give you an example from sports. In 1954, until this one guy did this, physiologists and people in athletics said nobody can break a 4 minute mile. You can't run a 4 minute mile. Roger Bannister does it, and you know what? Over the next few years, several people, dozens of people do it over time. So my dad, being a sports producer, I talked to many athletes. It was really interesting to talk to them and to hear that we set limits on ourselves. And sometimes it's fear. So, for example, if you are outperforming things in athletics, it used to be, especially in the 90s, if you were an incredible performer, they might have put you through drug testing every single day because you must have been on performance enhancing drugs because there's no way you can do that. So we set limits. We set limits on kids, parents who tell their kids they're stupid. Kids believe they're stupid. There are things that are done, unfortunately, in the education system, in with the way the world works, that these things are impossible. And while they may be impossible physics wise and maybe culturally, there's a lot more to us. So humans are more than what we think we are, and that's what psychic phenomena is all about. There's more to us.
Mm. All right, Lloyd, let's talk business. You had a chocolate business. You
Yeah, I
sold
sort of do still.
chocolates.
Yeah.
Tell me, what inspired your love, your fascination for the art of the chocolates?
Well, living in the Bay Area. First of all, I'm a food guy. I love food of all type. And living in the Bay Area, you get to know wine really well. That's California, Northern California wine. So I was a wine guy, and one of the wineries in the early 1990s we were going to constantly was starting to sell these new chocolate bars from a new company called Scharfenberger that had started up in Berkeley. And it was really dark chocolate, and I had never had chocolate that good. I like chocolate, but I didn't love it. So I tried this stuff, and now suddenly I'm kind of searching around for other kinds of really good dark chocolate. I started learning about chocolate, and in the early 2000s, I read so much about it and was actually introducing friends and other people to chocolate. I think I brought some bars of really good chocolate with me on a trip to a ghost conference up in Seattle, and there was a woman who ran a publishing house, and she had published a number of books on ghosts herself, and she was into chocolate, so I did a little tasting for her, and she said I ought to write a book about how I learned all this stuff. So over time, it's kind of looking into that. I started doing chocolate tastings for my day job at because I work for a company called LexisNexis, an online information company, and was doing chocolate tastings as part of my in-person presentations for law firms too, just to kind of get them in there instead of just offering them lunch. Um, I started doing chocolate tastings at the winery, kind of wine and chocolate pairings. And while the research on the book ended up going nowhere because the publisher ended up selling her business and nobody else wanted it, I got to talk to a number of really amazing chocolate makers here in the Bay Area. Joseph Schmidt, who was a big name in the chocolate world at that time, going to his factory and spending time with him, he said to me, "Well, if you're writing a book on this, you should learn how to make chocolate." And I found, actually, my wife found for me an online course from one of the better chocolate schools in North America. And I did that. I started making chocolate myself. I have a certificate as a professional chocolatier. Started
Ooh, that's
making and
cool.
selling chocolate. At the time, I wasn't working full time for Lexus. I wasn't working for them at all. So I had time to go to a kitchen once a week and make some chocolate and sell them. I was doing ghost drops, basically little chocolate pieces with ghosties on them. My business is called Haunted by Chocolate. And I was continuing, and still to this day, I don't make chocolate to sell these days because I'm too busy for that at the moment. But I continue to do chocolate guided chocolate tastings, both for the Lexus customers and also for outside groups as well. It's kind of a fun thing to do, and I'm always on the lookout for some other good chocolate that I don't know. I got to meet a number of good chocolate makers over the years and chat with them, and I have certain favorites and so on. I occasionally still make chocolate for friends and for special occasions, especially around Halloween. I'll do some things for some people. And I've actually done webinars on how to make chocolate truffles too. So it's a fun thing. It's one of my loves.
That's so cool. Well, since you're a chocolate connoisseur, is everyday grocery store chocolate just below you now? I feel like your taste palate's so above that. You're just
Well,
why would you bother eating a Snickers?
no, I don't eat candy at all. That's candy. That's not even a chocolate bar. The fact is that like I used to love Milky Way bars and Three Musketeers, and it's got way too much sugar for me now. My tastes are a little bit different. Um, there are supermarkets here in the Bay Area, and I know other parts of the country because I've been to them, where they sell good chocolate bars, and some of them are around $5. They seem a lot more expensive because they're good. I mean, I don't think most people know that a Hershey bar typically has less than 15% chocolate actually in the bar. It's all milk and sugar. So looking for good chocolate bars, it's not hard to find them at a lot of places. You just have to find the ones you like and try. And there, of course, there's really good milk chocolate. There's chocolate that has higher content of cocoa or cacao, and I'd say look for those. That's where you're going to get some really good chocolate flavor and much better quality for that. But yeah, if somebody offers a Hershey bar to me, it's like, yeah, I'll give it away to somebody. That's I'm not even going to unwrap it or smell it.
Oh, that's awesome. Well, Lloyd, this was fun. Is there anything else you want to leave with our audience?
Just that my books are available on Amazon. Just throw my name into the search engine. Um, and I recently, not too long ago, reprinted. It's actually a second edition of my book, A Paranormal Casebook, and it's cases that I have from like the first 25 or so years of my career. So some really good ghost cases and other cases. There were actually a few cases in there, a couple cases where it was a surprise, but it wasn't a ghost. But there's some really cool stuff in there too. So I recommend that one. ESP Wars I mentioned before also available on Amazon, and I do an every other week Q&A, live Q&A on YouTube, and my channel is youtube.com/at ask professor paranormal. So you can find the next one I'm going to be doing is August 11th and then the 25th, and we'll continue into September as well.
Cool. We'll
And then
make
of
sure to
course,
plug all Lloyd's information in the
yeah, thanks.
description on our YouTube video.
Yeah, and let people know about the courses at the Rhine Education Center. So that's just rhine.org, rhine.org, and just click on the education button.
Cool. Well, Lloyd, thank you so much for coming on Worldviews.
Thank you too. Thank you for having me.